Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we take on complex topics, grab a stack of sources, and zero in on the essential knowledge you need to cut through the noise and be truly well-informed.
Hello.
Today, we are plunging headfirst into a relationship that's not just one of the most important in Asia, but, well, globally, really. The incredibly complex and constantly evolving ties between India and China.
Two giants, absolutely.
Our guide for this deep dive is a fantastic historical account, tracing this connection all the way back from ancient times, weaving through the dramatic turns of the 20th century, and bringing us into the early 2000s. It's packed with key events, pivotal policies, and the figures who shaped them.
That's right. And our mission today is pretty clear. We're going to systematically unpack this long history using this source material. We really want to extract the absolute most important insights, understand the core dynamics that have been at play, and look specifically at those critical areas where these two Asian giants have managed to find cooperation, where they've inevitably clashed. And those enduring issues like the border dispute and the sensitive question of Tibet that continue to define their relationship even today.
It really is a relationship with roots stretching back millennia, as our source makes clear, built on deep historical and cultural ties. But in the modern era, it's undergone some pretty dramatic and, as we'll see, sometimes violent shifts.
Huge shifts.
And these shifts aren't happening in a vacuum, are they? They're profoundly impacted by historical legacies, by major geopolitical earthquakes on the world stage, and of course by significant internal developments happening within both India and China.
Absolutely crucial context.
Okay, let's unpack this history and see what our source reveals.
Let's do it. When we look back, the historical connection is incredibly deep, really stretching back over 2,000 years. Our source highlights the extensive cultural exchanges during this long period.
Yeah, like Buddhism going from India to China.
Exactly. That's a prime example. You've got ideas, philosophy, art flowing between these two massive ancient civilizations. It points to a very long period where coexistence and significant interaction were the norm.
And this wasn't confined just to religious or cultural ties in antiquity, was it? The source notes that we see early signs of modern political cooperation even before India achieved its independence.
That's right.
It specifically mentions the Brussels Conference way back in 1927. Representatives from China and India were there, and they issued a joint statement. What was the significance of that?
Well, that joint statement was quite forward-thinking for its time, wasn't it? It directly underlined the need for active Sino-Indian cooperation, specifically in the task of liberating Asia from Western imperialism.
Wow.
It showed a shared perspective, a sense of solidarity on a major global issue, the impact of colonial or semi-colonial pressures that affected both nations deeply.
And that sense of solidarity wasn't just talk, right? The source points out that India demonstrated tangible support for China during a really challenging time, the Japanese attack on Manchuria in 1931.
Yes, absolutely. India didn't just offer sympathy. There was a boycott of Japanese goods in India, and they even observed a specific China Day.
So real actions.
These were concrete actions taken by the Indian nationalist movement, demonstrating a real level of sympathy and support towards China during a period of external aggression. It built a foundation, of perceived shared struggle against foreign domination.
Okay, so moving closer now to India's independence, our source brings up the Asian Relations Conference held in New Delhi in March of 1947. This was quite a landmark event, wasn't it?
Huge. Convened by Jawaharlal Nehru.
Right, who was the interim prime minister at the time, just before India officially gained independence. You'd expect this conference to be all about forging Asian unity and cooperation post-colonialism.
That was the hope.
But even here, according to the source, points of friction were already starting to emerge.
Yes, and this is quite revealing about the underlying sensitivities, I think. The Chinese delegates at this conference, sent by the Kuomintang government, the KMT, led by Chiang Kai-shek, raised objections right away.
Really? What about?
They objected specifically to a map that was displayed which did not show Tibet as part of China. And they also protested against India's decision to recognize the Tibetan delegation that was present at the conference.
So even before India was fully independent, the status of Tibet and how India perceived or represented it was already a sensitive flashpoint with the established Chinese government of the time.
Precisely. And our source draws a telling contrast here. It notes that while the KMT government in China was quite agitated about this map and the Tibetan delegation, they showed no similar concern whatsoever when Pakistan-supported tribesmen committed aggression on Kashmir shortly after India gained independence.
That's fascinating, that early divergence in priorities.
Exactly. It perhaps hints at the complex, self-interested geopolitical considerations that would later come to define the relationship.
That's a really interesting early signal of tension lurking beneath the surface of hopeful Asian unity. Okay, let's transition into the post-independence era. India, of course, was immediately grappling with the immense problems stemming from partition.
Huge problem.
Oh, China was still deeply embroiled in its own civil war. Our source uses a quote from the scholar Werner Levi to characterize the state of relations during this immediate period.
Yeah, Levi noted that direct bilateral relations between India and China during this time were quite limited. Apart from contacts within international bodies like the UN, interactions were mostly confined to the necessary formalities and the routine of usual international contact.
Makes sense. They both had massive internal issues.
Totally. Both nations were heavily preoccupied with immense internal challenges, rebuilding after war, dealing with internal conflict, managing the fallout of division, which naturally limited the scope for extensive bilateral engagement right away.
But as we know, the situation in China was about to change fundamentally.
Mm.
The Civil War continued, eroding the authority of the KMT government.
Right.
And by September of 1949, the Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong, had effectively gained control of mainland China. This, of course, led to the KMT forces retreating to the island of Taiwan.
And then came the monumental event on October 1st, 1949, the formal proclamation of the People's Republic of China, the PRC, in Peking. This wasn't just a change of government, it was a revolutionary transformation.
Absolutely. Huge implications.
For China itself, for Asia, and, well, for the entire world order.
And India made a really significant and remarkably early move in response to this. Our source points out that India was actually among the very first countries outside of the communist bloc to recognize the new PRC.
Very swift. The date given is December 30th, 1949.
Less than 3 months after the proclamation.
Indeed. And Prime Minister Nehru's reasoning for this move, as quoted in the source, was very pragmatic and based on realpolitik, really. He viewed it as a fundamental revolution involving millions of people, one that had produced a stable, clearly entrenched, and popular government that was in undeniable control of the country.
So recognize reality.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
His stance was that recognizing this reality was the right thing to do from an international perspective, regardless of whether one personally liked the communist system or not.
India's ambassador to China at that time, K.M. Panikkar, had an interesting initial assessment, according to the source.
He did. Panikkar initially thought that achieving genuinely cordial and intimate relations with communist China was unlikely. However, he still hoped for cooperation, and notably, he identified Tibet as the only area where their direct interests significantly overlapped.
Which, wow, looking back,
Yeah.
that's grimly ironic, isn't it?
Terribly ironic. Because Tibet became a major source of intense conflict rather than cooperation. India's early international stance was also quite notable. India became a strong advocate for the PRC's claim to China's seat at the United Nations.
And that wasn't a popular position everywhere, was it? Particularly in the West.
Far from it. It caused considerable displeasure among several non-communist countries, most notably the United States, which still recognized the KMT government in Taiwan.
Right.
But India's consistent stand, as our source emphasizes, was based purely on the merit of the case. The PRC was the de facto government controlling mainland China and therefore should represent the country in the UN. Simple as that in their view.
There were already early complexities and bumps in the road, though, even internationally. Our source mentions that India's positive response to the UN resolution declaring North Korea the aggressor after the Korean War began in June 1950 caused some initial unpleasantness in Peking.
Yes, a brief moment of diplomatic friction there. But, importantly, the source notes that India later stood by China against U.S. efforts to censure China for its involvement in the Korean War. And this stance by India was appreciated by China and helped smooth over that earlier unpleasantness. It shows India trying to navigate the emerging Cold War landscape while still extending a hand of engagement to the new China.
And Nehru seemed to possess a certain foresight regarding China's potential trajectory. In a letter to Ambassador Panikkar, quote in the source, Nehru observed that historically, a strong, centralized Chinese government had a tendency towards expansion. He predicted this would likely be seen in the vigorously pulsating and dynamic new China that emerged from the revolution.
That's quite prescient.
He recognized that the 1949 revolution wasn't just a superficial change, it was deeply grassroots.
And this recognition of China's internal dynamism and historical tendencies appears to have informed Nehru's overall policy approach towards the PRC. As Professor V.P. Dutt is quoted, Nehru's strategy was centered on, well, befriending the Chinese Revolution,
Okay.
working to bring the new China into the global community, encouraging contacts, and trying to lessen existing hostilities and suspicions. The clear underlying hope was to avoid conflict by fostering engagement and understanding.
So a policy based on optimism, really.
Very much so. And the belief that a strong, engaged China would be a force for Asian peace.
That optimistic policy, however, was soon going to face its first and perhaps most significant test, the issue of Tibet and China's determined assertion of sovereignty over the region. Let's dig into the history of Tibet's status as laid out in our source.
Right. Tibet occupies a hugely strategic location. It borders India to the north, but also Nepal, Burma, and China's large Xinjiang province. It's famously and accurately described as the roof of the world due to its incredibly high altitude.
NASA, very.
Huge, covering a vast area of roughly 47,000 square miles.
And its traditional political and social system was quite unique, wasn't it? Centered on the Buddhist faith.
Exactly. The Dalai Lama served as both the spiritual leader and the temporal, meaning political, head of the state. The social structure is described in the source as resembling a kind of feudal order.
What about its historical connection with China? The source describes it as varied.
Yeah, vague and varied over time. Historically, Tibet had periods as a powerful independent state, but its political connection with China had become, well, complicated. Our source notes that it came under significant Chinese influence or even occupation in the 18th century following a conflict over succession,
Okay.
and was generally recognized as part of China during much of the 19th century, though the nature of that control fluctuated.
And then British involvement in India added another layer of complexity.
Definitely. In 1890, the British rulers in India concluded a treaty with China that aimed to demarcate the Indo-Tibetan border. However, and this is key, this treaty was explicitly rejected by the Tibetan rulers themselves.
Why?
They didn't see China as having the authority to negotiate on their behalf regarding their borders.
Interesting.
This rejection, coupled with growing fears of Russian interference in Tibetan affairs, prompted further British action. In 1904, Lord Curzon, the then Governor-General of India, dispatched British Indian troops under Colonel Francis Young Husband into Tibet.
The Young Husband Expedition.
Exactly. The stated objective was to counter Russian influence and bring Tibet more firmly under the British sphere of influence. During this expedition, the 13th Dalai Lama actually fled to China.
And this military action led to treaties that further shaped Tibet's international status, often from the perspective of external powers, right?
Yes. In 1906, British India signed a treaty with China where Britain accepted Chinese suzerainty over Tibet. The source notes this was effectively a dictated treaty from Britain's strong position.
Suzerainty, not sovereignty. That's an important distinction.
Crucial distinction. It allowed Britain to station a British agent in Lhasa, establish a postal system, and crucially maintain troops in Tibet to protect trade routes.
Then came the Anglo-Russian Entente.
Shortly after, in 1907, this resolved British and Russian disagreements regarding Tibet's status. Both powers accepted Chinese suzerainty and agreed that they would deal with Tibet only through the Chinese government. So, from the perspective of these major global powers, Tibet was firmly placed under Chinese authority, albeit with that specific status of suzerainty.
And just to clarify for listeners, suzerainty often means a degree of control by a larger power over a semi-autonomous territory, but not full sovereignty. The larger power might manage external relations, maybe defense.
But the internal affairs are largely left to the local ruler. That was the theoretical status agreed upon by Britain and Russia.
A status the Tibetans themselves often push back against.
Consistently. For instance, after the Chinese Revolution in 1911, Tibet successfully expelled Chinese troops and resisted China's subsequent attempts to reestablish its authority.
Which brings us to the crucial Shimla Conference in 1914, attended by Britain, China, and Tibet.
Yes. While the conference aimed to sort out border differences involving several Himalayan states and ultimately confirm Chinese suzerainty over Tibet, it also attempted to divide Tibet into Outer Tibet and Inner Tibet.
And crucially,
it accepted the autonomy of Outer Tibet, with China agreeing not to interfere in its internal administration, station troops there, appoint civil servants, or try to turn it into a Chinese province. This is also where the McMahon Line was drawn, demarcating the border between British India and Tibet in the east.
So even while acknowledging China's overarching authority suzerainty, there was an international agreement, even if later disputed by China regarding its ratification, that recognized a significant degree of internal autonomy for Outer Tibet.
Correct. However, the source points out that the KMT government in China continued to try and assert greater control, making repeated attempts between 1933 and 1939 to regulate Tibet's foreign and even domestic policy.
So the tension remained. And by the end of World War II,
China was still largely unable to effectively exercise control over Tibet, and Tibet continued to insist on being an autonomous country. From India's perspective, now moving rapidly towards independence, an autonomous Tibet was seen as a valuable buffer state between India and its large northern neighbor.
the status remained somewhat vague during the Chinese Civil War.
But with the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949, this ambiguity quickly evaporated. The new communist leadership made its intentions regarding Tibet explicitly clear from the outset.
Right. On January 1st, 1950, the PRC government publicly stated that liberating Tibet was one of the fundamental tasks for the People's Liberation Army.
And this wasn't just a passing mention. This determination was reiterated by prominent Chinese leaders. Liberation was the goal.
However, China initially offered assurances to India regarding their intentions in Tibet, didn't they?
They did. Premier Chow Enlai reportedly told India's Ambassador Panikkar that while the liberation of Tibet was a sacred duty for China, it would be pursued through negotiations, not military force.
And India believed this.
India, finding this assurance satisfactory, even suggested facilitating talks between China and Tibet when the Dalai Lama sought India's assistance.
But that period of apparent reassurance was very brief.
Extremely brief. In October 1950, India received news that China had launched a full-scale military invasion of Tibet.
How did India react?
India reacted with a formal protest, expressing its surprise and regret at China's decision to use military force, especially given the earlier assurances of seeking a peaceful, negotiated resolution.
And China's response?
Swift and unyielding. They rejected India's protest outright and accused India of being influenced by imperialist powers, a common refrain from Peking at the time towards non-aligned nations that voiced concerns about its actions.
So, faced with that rejection and the reality on the ground,
India subsequently adjusted its position. It formally recognized Chinese suzerainty over Tibet and stated that it had no intention of interfering in China's internal affairs. This was a reiteration of earlier stances, but reinforced in the face of the invasion.
what about the Dalai Lama?
The Dalai Lama, seeing the situation deteriorate, left Tibet briefly and attempted, though unsuccessfully, to raise the issue of Tibet's situation at the United Nations.
But China pushed ahead?
Yes, China refused to countenance genuine Tibetan autonomy. This led to the signing of the 1951 agreement between China and the Tibetan authorities.
The 17-point agreement.
That's the one. This agreement acknowledged full Chinese sovereignty over Tibet, but granted only limited autonomy in certain matters. As our source points out, India's preference and historical interest lay in seeing Tibet retain full autonomy under Chinese suzerainty, a model that was not fulfilled by the 1951 agreement.
And looking at the details of that 1951 agreement, the limited nature of the promised autonomy is pretty clear, isn't it?
It's very clear. While it paid lip service to Tibetan autonomy, China would control external relations, station its army for defense and integration purposes, merging the Tibetan army with the PLA, and base its administrative and military mission in Lhasa.
So effectively controlling everything important.
Pretty much. While it promised respect for the Dalai Lama and religious freedom, in practical terms, the source states that for all essential purposes, Tibet became Chinese territory, effectively ending its long-standing semi-autonomous status.
And this generated criticism of India's policy.
Significant criticism, both within India and internationally. Critics argued that India had abdicated its legitimate interests in Tibet and had sacrificed Tibetan autonomy, seemingly in an effort to appease the new communist rulers in Peking and maintain good relations.
A major point of contention for decades.
Absolutely. The source highlights that India's Tibet policy from this period onwards has remained an item of severe criticism, seen by many as a major misstep.
The source also adds important context about the Tibetan resistance itself, doesn't it? It didn't just happen in a vacuum.
No, it notes that the Tibetan disaffection and the subsequent uprising stemmed directly from the failure of China's own policies in Tibet, despite claims of introducing land reforms and development. Tibetans argued the root cause was the forcible entry of Chinese troops aimed at destroying their traditional autonomy.
This led to the Kampa Revolt.
Starting in 1956, yes. But it was the major uprising in Lhasa in March 1959 and the dramatic escape of the Dalai Lama to India that truly galvanized public opinion in India and internationally.
And India granted him asylum.
Yes. And when India granted political asylum to the Dalai Lama in 1959, this act, even though India carefully advised the Dalai Lama not to allow Indian soil to be used for anti-China resistance and presented it as a purely humanitarian gesture,
China saw it differently.
completely differently. It was viewed by China as an act of hostility, almost like an enemy state would behave. China even went so far as to accuse India of expansionism, baseless allegations that the source explicitly calls untrue.
They linked it to Nehru personally.
They did, controversially linking the Tibetan revolt and the Dalai Lama's asylum to Nehru's philosophy, which the source labels as a thoughtless mistake on Fana's part, especially considering Nehru's consistent efforts, even risking displeasing Western powers, to foster friendship and faith in the relationship with China.
Domestically, though, Nehru faced criticism for being too soft.
Immense criticism for being perceived as too soft or naive in his dealings with China. But as the quote from VP Dutt reminds us, the hard reality was that India simply did not possess the military strength or capability at that time to intervene effectively and help Tibet retain its independence.
A grim reality.
Yeah. China's military assertion in Tibet and the subsequent reactions in India, particularly the Dalai Lama's arrival, significantly darkened the overall picture for India-China relations, laying bare the fundamental divergence on this issue.
Despite the very real disappointment and negative implications of China's actions in Tibet, India, according to the source, initially made efforts not to let it completely derail the broader friendship with China.
That's a key point. India continued its strong international support for China, notably regarding its persistent demand for representation in the United Nations.
Even after the invasion of Tibet.
Yes, and remarkably, this support continued even during and after the 1962 border aggression, which speaks volumes about India's commitment to its stated policy towards the PRC. The source also notes that China did appreciate India's stand on international platforms, citing India's support during the later phase of the Korean crisis from 1950 to 1953.
This period also saw negotiations for a more formal economic relationship, leading to a trade agreement.
Yes, the agreement concerning trade and intercourse between the Tibet region of China and India was signed on April 29, 1954, and was initially valid for 8 years. This agreement was significant because it marked a formal acceptance of China's control over Tibet in the context of trade.
And in this 1954 agreement, India made some notable concessions, didn't it? Formalizing the new reality in Tibet.
It did. India surrendered its extraterritorial rights in Tibet that it had inherited from the British colonial era. It formally accepted China's full sovereignty over Tibet, explicitly acknowledging Tibet as a region of China.
Big steps.
And it gave up the right to station Indian Army troops in Tibet, a right the British had held.
And this agreement is perhaps most famous because it incorporated the 5 principles.
Panchshil. Exactly. The 5 principles that would become the globally recognized Panchshil, intended to be the guiding principles for bilateral relations between India and China.
The signing of this trade agreement set the stage for high-level political exchanges. Right.
Yep.
Chou Enlai visited India.
June 1954, followed by Prime Minister Nehru's visit to China in October 1954. Both leaders were reportedly received very warmly, reinforcing the positive atmosphere.
And the formalization of Panchshil happened when?
At the end of Premier Chow's visit to New Delhi in June 1954, a joint statement was issued emphasizing these 5 principles as the foundation to guide and regulate bilateral relations moving forward.
Let's list those 5 principles again, because they became so influential.
Certainly, they were. 1. Mutual respect for each other's territorial integrity and sovereignty. 2. Mutual non-aggression. 3. Mutual non-interference in each other's internal affairs. 4. Equality and mutual benefit. And 5. Peaceful coexistence.
And it was in this context, despite the earlier disagreements and India's disappointment over the loss of Tibet's autonomy, that Nehru and Chou not only reaffirmed their faith in Panchshil, but critically, explicitly agreed that Tibet was a part of the People's Republic of China.
A hugely significant affirmation in that joint statement. And this set of principles proved highly influential beyond just the bilateral relationship. Panchshil was later adopted with only minor modifications by the Bandung Conference of Afro-Asian Nations in 1955.
Right, Bandung.
And subsequently embraced by many countries around the world as a basis for international relations, symbolizing a new approach to interstate conduct, particularly among newly independent nations.
The period immediately following the Panchshil Agreement, roughly from 1954 to 1958, is often characterized as the honeymoon phase of Sino-Indian relations.
Yes, those years are frequently described as the Sino-Indian honeymoon and are encapsulated by that popular slogan, Hindi Chini Bye Bye, meaning Indians and Chinese are brothers.
Lots of high-level visits, too.
Absolutely. Premier Chow Enlai made 4 visits to India during this relatively short 4-year span, highlighting the intensity of the engagement.
And the peak of this perceived friendship seems to have been the Bandung Conference in April 1955.
Yes, the source notes that Chow Enlai and Nehru worked together there in very close cooperation, projecting an image of Asian solidarity.
Were there tangible examples of this mutual support?
There were. On specific international issues, India extended full moral and diplomatic backing to China's claim over Taiwan, referred to as Formosa and the offshore islands of Quemoy and Matsu. In return, China supported India's claim to the Portuguese colonial possession of Goa.
So outwardly, the picture was one of burgeoning friendship and shared goals on the global stage. But as our source makes clear, beneath this surface, the seeds of conflict were already being sown.
Unfortunately, yes.
And the first significant indicator of trouble, the first taste of conflict, is pointed to in July 1958. What happened?
This is when maps began appearing in official Chinese publications, specifically China Pictorial, that showed certain Indian territories as part of China.
Which territories?
The areas in question were substantial, approximately 38,000 square miles in India's northeast and about 12,000 square miles in the northwest areas India considered unquestionably its own.
How did India react?
India naturally drew China's attention to these maps, pointing out that they were incorrect or improper.
And the response from Peking?
The initial explanation from the Chinese side was dismissive, really. They claimed these were simply reproductions of old Kuomintang maps, that the new communist government hadn't had time to conduct a new comprehensive survey of its borders, and therefore wouldn't be making changes to the maps pending such a survey.
Convenient.
The source explicitly identifies this exchange as the beginning of the border dispute between India and China.
It's quite striking how, as Jugat Esmeda notes regarding this 1954-58 period, the relations were outwardly positive and harmonious, notwithstanding the ideological divergence and the known differences on the notions of the common border.
That's a very insightful observation.
He observed that during this time, on the border and in the implementation of Tibet Agreement, there were difficulties, but consistent with the cherished overall logic of good relations, they were minimized or suppressed.
That's critical. It reveals that even during the Hindi Chini Bye Bye phase, the fundamental disagreements over territory and the implications of China's assertion of control over Tibet were not resolved. They were consciously downplayed or suppressed in favor of maintaining the positive facade.
So the problems were bubbling under the surface.
Exactly. And the unfolding developments in Tibet, particularly the increasing Chinese control and Tibetan resistance, further undermined India's underlying faith in China's stated sincerity regarding peaceful coexistence. Intrusions along the border began, and China started not only claiming Indian territory, but also accusing Indian troops of unlawful intrusion into what it now considered Chinese territory.
Okay, let's focus specifically now on the border dispute itself, which became the central point of contention. Our source describes the long border stretching over 2,200 miles.
A massive border.
Which was generally regulated by historical agreements, arrangements, and often clear natural dividing lines like watersheds.
Yes, despite these existing understandings, disagreements arose. The border is conventionally divided into 3 main sectors. The eastern sector, which is east of Bhutan, the central sector running across the modern Indian states of Uttar Pradesh, Punjab, and Himachal Pradesh, and the western sector, covering the part of Jammu and Kashmir that borders China's Xinjiang and Tibet regions, particularly Ladakh.
And the main areas where the dispute was concentrated were specifically the McMahon Line in the northeast and the Ladakh area in the northwest.
Exactly. In the eastern sector, the boundary east of Bhutan is defined by the McMahon Line. India has consistently treated this as a lawfully demarcated and accepted boundary.
But China's view?
China, conversely, has condemned it as an imperialist line, arguing it was imposed by British India on Tibet.
The origins of the McMahon Line, as we touched upon earlier, trace back to the Shimla Conference of 1914.
Right. This conference involved representatives from British India, Tibet, and China, aiming to settle border differences involving several Himalayan states. Arthur Henry McMahon, who was the Secretary of State for India in British India's administration, represented India.
And he drew the line.
He drew a line on a map, typically with a red pen, marking the boundary between Tibet and India along the high mountain peaks, often following the watershed principle. This line became known as the McMahon Line. Our source describes it as being, in many ways, a natural boundary running along the crest of the Himalayas between the Tibet Plateau to the north and the Indian Hills to the south.
The map containing this line was signed by the representatives of British India, Tibet, and China, but, and this is a crucial historical detail, the Chinese government at the time did not ratify the convention.
Precisely. A key point of contention later. However, our source makes a very significant point. India always accepted the McMahon Line as the valid border, and no government of China, whether it was the KMT government that signed the map or the later communist government, ever disputed this boundary line formally until much, much later.
That's central to India's claim.
Absolutely. It's central to India's legal and historical claim in the eastern sector.
Okay, moving to the western sector. The area of Ladakh is part of Jammu and Kashmir, which ceded to India after partition.
Right. Now, the border between Ladakh and China was not defined by a specific treaty like the McMahon Line was intended to be. However, an existing boundary line had been accepted for centuries by both sides.
Based on tradition and usage.
Exactly. This line was consistently depicted in Indian maps and was referenced by travelers, visitors, and historical records over a long period.
And specifically regarding the area of Aksai Chin within Ladakh.
Our source mentions that India's position, as conveyed in a note to China back in 1899, stated clearly that Aksai Chin was Indian territory. Further, the revenue records of Jammu and Kashmir also consistently confirm that Aksai Chin had always been administered as part of Ladakh.
So from India's perspective, in both the eastern and western sectors, their claims were based on long-accepted lines, historical understandings, and in the east, a line drawn in a conference attended by representatives from all three parties involved, even if Chinese ratification was absent.
Correct, which makes China's later claim that the boundary had never been formally delimited a direct challenge to these historical understandings and India's position.
Our source identifies the actual trigger that escalated these simmering border differences into an open dispute, beyond just the maps. It was a physical act by China, wasn't it?
Yes, the construction of a major road across the Aksai Chin area in Ladakh carried out between 1956 and 1957.
The Aksai Chin Road. Why was it so significant?
This road was highly strategic for China. It was built to link Tibet with China's western province of Xinjiang, aimed at opening up western Tibet to Chinese immigrants, and importantly, to divert trade away from its traditional routes southward into India towards western China and the Soviet Union.
And the crucial point.
The crucial point is that this road was constructed through territory that India considered unquestionably its own, effectively altering the reality on the ground and unilaterally imposing China's claim.
Were there earlier protests from India about border issues, maybe less dramatic ones?
There were. In July 1954, quite soon after the Panchsheel Agreement, actually, China protested what it called alleged Indian occupation of an area called Barahuti in Uttar Pradesh, which China claimed.
And India.
India rejected this claim, stating Barahuti was Indian territory. There were also reports of intrusions by Chinese officials based in Tibet into this area. Interestingly, Nehru, during his October 1954 visit to China, apparently dismissed this specific incident as a minor one.
But the issue of the maps didn't go away.
No, it didn't. China, after the Communist Revolution, hadn't formally raised the overall boundary question until India noticed the large area shown as Chinese on their maps, totaling some 48,000 square miles, and protested.
And China's response was still dismissive.
That initially, yes. As we mentioned, they dismissed these as reproductions of old KMT maps, stating corrections would be made later. Even during Premier Chow En-lai's visit to India in 1956, when Nehru again drew his attention to the continued presence of these lines on the maps, Chow reportedly assured Nehru that the McMahon Line was acceptable to China and implied corrections would follow.
So Prime Minister Nehru had received these repeated assurances, downplaying specific incidents and even getting a verbal commitment regarding the McMahon Line. That's why the letter sent by Premier Chow En-lai to Nehru on January 23, 1959, must have been such a profound shock and disappointment.
It was a complete bombshell, a total reversal of earlier stances. In that letter, Chow En-lai didn't just acknowledge the maps. He formally laid claim to thousands of square miles of Indian territory.
Claiming the whole boundary was undefined.
Exactly. He explicitly argued that the entire Sino-Indian boundary had never been formally delimited, and breaking from any implied acceptance, controversially stated that the McMahon Line was merely a product of British policy of aggression against the Tibet region of China and was therefore illegal.
And China's reason for waiting until 1959 to make this formal claim.
Their stated reason was simply that the time had not been opportune earlier. This naturally led India to question why early 1959 suddenly became the opportune moment for such a dramatic shift and formal claim.
And the context provided by the source explains that timing, doesn't it?
Absolutely. By early 1959, Tibet had been fully integrated into China, effectively ending its autonomy. Chinese troops had been strategically positioned all along the lengthy Sino-Indian border, and that vital strategic road through the Aksai-Chin area had been completed.
So they were in a much stronger position.
Exactly. China was in a much stronger military and logistical position along the border to assert its claims. This was no longer just about maps, it was about consolidating control on the ground.
This diplomatic escalation, the shock of the formal claim and the rejection of the McMahon Line, was quickly followed by military incidents, wasn't it?
Yes, a series of increasingly serious military incidents along the border. In July 1959, Chinese troops moved into Kumak Fort in Ladakh and even arrested an Indian patrol party in the Aksai-Chin area.
And in the east.
In early August of 1959, a Chinese patrol crossed the Indian border at Kimzernan in what was then the Northeast Frontier Agency, now Arunachal Pradesh.
How did Nehru respond publicly?
Prime Minister Nehru's public response, as conveyed in his statement to the Lok Sabha on August 28, 1959, reflected a cautious but firm approach. He stated, "While I do not wish to take an alarmist view of the situation, we shall naturally be prepared for any eventuality and, without fuss or shouting, keep vigilant."
Wow, trying to manage the situation.
Trying to balance public anxiety with diplomatic restraint, but the situation was clearly deteriorating rapidly.
And tragically, the situation did worsen significantly just 2 months later, in October 1959.
A deadly clash occurred near Konka Pass, located about 50 miles inside territory India considered unquestionably its own in Ladakh. 9 Indian soldiers, or Jawans, were killed, and 10 others were captured by Chinese forces.
And Konka Pass, that was a major turning point.
A huge turning point. The Konka Pass clash brought Sino-Indian relations almost to a breaking point. Public opinion in India, fueled by media coverage, was incredibly strong and vocal, demanding drastic action, everything from breaking diplomatic relations to expelling the perceived aggressor by force.
India's China policy must have come under intense fire.
It faced bitter and widespread criticism in the media and parliament. The whole approach, championed for years, was suddenly seen as naive or ineffective.
Did India try to de-escalate after Konka Pass?
Yes. India put forward a proposal for a troop withdrawal. The idea was that Indian troops would withdraw south of China's claimed line in Ladakh, provided that Chinese troops withdrew north of the line shown in Indian maps. The goal was to create a clear separation and reduce the risk of further clashes.
Did China accept?
No, China rejected this de-escalation proposal. Instead of reciprocal withdrawal on September 8, 1959, just before the Konka Pass incident, actually coinciding with an earlier border crossing, the Chinese premier formally and publicly laid claim to about 50,000 square miles of Indian territory.
Wow, 50,000 square miles.
This formalized the claims hinted at in the earlier maps and discussions, confirming the sheer scale of the dispute.
So the Konka Pass incident in October 1959, following that formal territorial claim in September, truly marked the point of no return. The hopeful era of Hindi-Chini bye-bye was effectively over.
Completely over. Replaced by serious confrontation and the looming threat of wider conflict.
Yes, and that threat unfortunately materialized into war in 1962. Our source notes the debate among historians and analysts regarding whether Prime Minister Nehru's public statement on October 13, 1962.
The throw them out statement.
Right, where he ordered the army to throw the Chinese out of Indian territory they had crossed since September 8, actually provoked the massive Chinese attack that followed.
It's a contentious point. The source quotes Lieutenant General B.M. Call, who was involved in the military command at the time, expressing surprise that Nehru would take such a courage posture when India's military preparedness was known to be weak.
What did Call speculate?
Call speculated that Nehru might have hoped to deter China, or perhaps the advice was given with public consumption in mind to placate domestic opinion.
But the source suggests the attack might have been coming anyway.
Regardless of whether Nehru's statement was a direct trigger, the source itself leans towards the view that China would have struck us anyhow, if not then, perhaps later, implying the attack was premeditated once China felt ready. What is undeniable is that the attack came with devastating speed and force.
When did it start?
On October 20th, 1962, China launched a massive coordinated attack simultaneously in the Northeast Frontier Agency, NEFA, and in the Ladakh sector in the west.
And the impact?
The scale and intensity of the assault were overwhelming for the Indian forward positions. The source notes that 2 important Indian posts in NEFA were captured within just 24 hours. Krishna Menon, who is India's defense minister, is quoted describing the attack's ferocity,
What did he say?
likening it to a locust unleashing its fury upon the Indian frontiers.
The Chinese advance was incredibly swift, wasn't it?
Remarkably swift and deep. By October 25, Chinese troops had pushed approximately 16 miles south of the McMahon Line in the eastern sector. After a brief lull, they resumed the large-scale attack on November 15th in both sectors. By November 16th, they had crossed a strategic mountain pass called Bomdila and were descending rapidly towards the plains of Assam in the east.
And in the western sector, Ladakh.
In Ladakh, the Chinese army successfully captured the entire area that China had been claiming, and across which they had built that strategic road, Aksai-Chin.
So they achieved their objectives there.
Yes. And in the eastern sector, their advance reached a point in Assam that effectively overlooked the Brahmaputra River Valley, the plains of Assam, and even extended towards the Bay of Bengal. They had achieved their military objectives on the ground in the disputed territories very quickly.
What about casualties?
The Indian Army, despite facing immense logistical challenges and being unprepared for the scale of the assault, fought bravely but suffered heavily in terms of casualties. The source notes that while Indian losses were significant, Chinese losses were also reported to be even heavier, highlighting the intensity of the fighting.
Was war formally declared?
Strangely, no. Despite the full-scale military engagement, there was no formal declaration of war by either side. Diplomatic missions remained open, albeit with skeleton staff, which is quite unusual for a conflict of this magnitude.
India sought help.
Yes, facing this military crisis, India made urgent appeals for external assistance. Both Britain and the United States responded swiftly, rushing necessary war material, particularly equipment suited for mountain warfare, to aid the Indian Army.
And then suddenly, China announced a ceasefire.
Just as suddenly as the major attack had begun? Yes. On November 21st, 1962, the Chinese government announced a unilateral ceasefire and withdrawal.
Had China proposed a ceasefire earlier?
They had. On October 26, 1962, just 6 days after the initial major attack began, it was a 3-point proposal.
What were the points?
The proposal suggested, 1. Both countries should cease fire immediately, honor the line of actual control, the LOC, that existed on November 7, 1959, a date China favored, and withdraw their forces 20 kilometers from this line.
Okay.
2. Even if India refused this general withdrawal, China offered to unilaterally withdraw its forces 20 kilometers north of the LOC, provided both countries respected that line of control. And 3, the prime ministers of the 2 countries should confer to discuss the boundary dispute.
How did India respond to that?
India rejected these proposals, viewing them as an attempt by China to consolidate its territorial gains made during the war. India's counter-suggestion was that China restore the status quo ante, meaning the situation on the border as it had existed on September 8, 1962, before the Chinese border crossing that preceded the final military escalation. China, unsurprisingly, did not accept this condition.
So after the unilateral ceasefire on November 21st,
China repeated its earlier 3-point proposals. India again turned them down, sticking to its demand for the September 8 status quo ante. This fundamental disagreement led to a prolonged stalemate.
and the outcome on the ground.
China withdrew, but only to its claimed lines, consolidating control over the occupied territories, particularly in Aksai-Chin.
The overall outcomes of the war were devastating for India.
Stark and with lasting consequences. India suffered a significant national humiliation, and China occupied large areas of Indian territory that it had claimed. The source speculates that the timely military assistance from Britain and the U.S. may have pressured China to announce the ceasefire and withdraw.
But China controlled the withdrawal.
Exactly. They withdrew only to the point they themselves had chosen, retaining the strategically vital areas they had captured.
And the assessment of Nehru's policy after this.
Understandably, severely critical. His policy lay in shambles, as the source puts it, although it notes that the fundamental postulates on which it was based, like peaceful coexistence, weren't necessarily wrong in themselves.
So where did the criticism lie?
The criticism centered on the fact that Nehru and his government hadn't fully grasped the extent of the change in Chinese foreign policy under Mao and its implications for the border. Furthermore, the source points out that public opinion in India had been left totally uneducated by the mass media regarding the realities of the border situation and the potential for conflict.
The legacy of the 1962 war was deep bitterness.
Intense bitterness, distrust, and mutual hostility that significantly impacted Sino-Indian relations for nearly 2 decades.
Even before the war, diplomatic efforts had failed, right?
Completely. The prime ministers met in April 1960, but their talks didn't resolve the border dispute. Officials from both sides met 3 times later in 1960 in Peking, Delhi, and Rangoon, but these meetings also ended without agreement.
What was Nehru's forward policy?
Under pressure from strong public sentiment following the border incidents, Prime Minister Nehru in late 1961 decided to implement this policy. It directed the Indian Army to establish a series of forward posts along the border, aiming to assert and exercise effective control up to India's claimed border lines.
How many posts?
By the end of 1961, around 50 such posts had been established. The source suggests that this step, intended to assert India's position, may have inadvertently provoked China to take military action sooner rather than later.
Adding another layer of complexity was the China-Pakistan alignment.
Yes, a crucial development. In May 1962, just months before the war, China concluded a border agreement with Pakistan concerning the disputed border between Pakistan-controlled Kashmir and China's Xinjiang province.
Bringing them closer together against India.
Exactly. This agreement brought these two powers, both with hostile relations towards India, very close together. It was seen as an extraordinary alliance, America's ally, Pakistan and Communist China finding common cause, largely based on their shared antagonism towards India.
And India's preparedness.
Unfortunately, our source highlights that India's defense forces at the time were not fully prepared for a large-scale conflict, and crucially, the political leadership, namely Nehru and Defense Minister V.K. Krishna Menon, reportedly refused to accept or act upon the Army's assignments regarding the likelihood of Chinese aggression.
So when the attack came,
Indian troops, despite displaying high morale and bravery, found it immensely difficult to contain the action. The source lists several incidents just before the major attack, like the seizure of an Indian police post in Galban Valley, Ladakh in July 1962, and the capture of soldiers there. India's protests were ignored.
looking back, the timing seemed right for China.
The context provided by this source is telling. Tibet integrated, Dalai Lama in India, Pakistan befriended, no immediate pressure from Taiwan, and around 25,000 square miles already effectively occupied or claimed. This was the backdrop against which China decided the time was opportune.
It's worth reflecting for a moment on how G.P. Deshpande, quoted in our source, characterizes the border dispute. He calls it both a major and minor problem.
That's an interesting framing. Minor, he argues, because a solution, while not immediately in sight, isn't inherently impossible.
But major because.
Major, he asserts, because Sino-Indian relations can never be regarded as fully normal unless there is a border settlement between two countries. He concludes pointedly that a border settlement cannot be a sufficient condition for normal Sino-Indian relations, but it is a necessary condition.
That's a fundamental point, isn't it?
Absolutely crucial. It means that achieving a border settlement won't automatically fix everything else, but crucially, without resolving the border, the relationship can never truly move into a state of full, trusting normalization. It remains a prerequisite.
Following the devastation and bitterness of the 1962 war, the period from roughly 1965 to 1980 was largely defined by continued hostility, although towards the end we start seeing some gradual steps towards normalization.
Yes, a long period of frostiness. During these years, China significantly deepened its close relations with Pakistan, which continued to be a major source of concern for India. Our source describes it as that strange combination, an Islamic state and a communist power largely aligned to isolate India regionally.
And this alignment was very clear during the 1965 India-Pakistan War.
Overtly demonstrated. China displayed clear hostility towards India and provided strong moral and diplomatic support to Pakistan. China had also become a significant aid provider to Pakistan, and Indian troops even reportedly captured armaments bearing Chinese markings from Pakistani forces during the conflict.
There was a particularly tense moment involving an ultimatum from China.
Yes, on September 16, 1965, right in the middle of the India-Pakistan War, China issued an ultimatum to India demanding that India vacate 56 military establishments along the India-Sikkim-China border, which China claimed had been illegally built.
How long did India have?
Just 3 days. China threatened serious consequences if India didn't comply.
This was clearly aimed at helping Pakistan.
Widely seen as exactly that, a move by China to demonstrate solidarity with Pakistan and create a second front or pressure point for India during the war. However, the big powers, likely the US and Soviet Union, were reportedly disturbed by this escalation and issued stern warnings to China not to precipitate a wider conflict.
And India's response?
Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri rejected China's claims, stating there was no truth to the accusation of boundary violations. The situation eventually de-escalated without China following through on its threat.
Under Indira Gandhi's premiership, starting in '66, were there attempts to improve relations?
There were several initiatives, but many proved unsuccessful in the face of the lingering distrust and border tension, and there were unfortunate incidents that highlighted the continued strained relationship.
Like what?
For example, in June 1967, 2 Chinese embassy officials were arrested in Delhi on charges of espionage, leading to a diplomatic spat. Militarily, in September 1967, China launched an attack on Indian positions at Natula Pass.
On the Sikkim border.
Yes, and again attacked another Indian post at Chola in October 1968, also on the Sikkim border. There were also reports of military manipulations by China at Natula in April 1968.
Did things calm down eventually?
Following criticism from many countries for these aggressive actions, China reportedly ceased large-scale aggressive actions against Indian border posts around 1970. India, in turn, signaled a desire for improvement, with External Affairs Minister Sardar Swan Singh making public calls for better Sino-Indian relations.
But China's hostility towards India continued during the Bangladesh crisis in 1971.
Yes, very much so. Strong support for Pakistan again. While initially not very vocal, China became a full and militant supporter of Pakistan as the crisis intensified, stopping just short of direct military intervention.
There were reports Bhutto misled Yahya Khan about Chinese intervention.
Our source notes that, yes, Zia Bhutto reportedly misled the Pakistani president Yahya Khan into believing that China had promised to intervene actively on Pakistan's side if war broke out, a promise that did not materialize.
What deterred China and the U.S. from intervening?
A crucial factor was likely the signing of the Indo-Soviet Treaty of Peace, Friendship, and Cooperation in August 1971. This treaty signaled strong Soviet support for India and acted as a significant deterrent.
China's stance at the UN was harsh.
Extremely harsh on the Bangladesh issue. Their permanent representative described India's actions as gangster logic and insisted that the situation in East Pakistan was purely an internal matter for Pakistan, dismissing the humanitarian crisis.
And after Bangladesh became independent,
China used its veto power in the UN Security Council to block Bangladesh's admission to the United Nations.
the source notes the irony there.
Yes, striking irony. China's primary motivation was to stand by its ally Pakistan, seemingly disregarding the fact that China's own representation in the UN had been blocked for over 2 decades by a U.S. veto. It highlights how strongly China prioritized its strategic alignment with Pakistan.
Despite all this, Indira Gandhi still expressed hope for improvement in '72.
She did, hoping relations could still move forward. However, tensions flared again with a border violation in the eastern sector in October 1975, resulting in the tragic deaths of 4 Indian soldiers.
This period also saw India's first nuclear test in 1974.
Right. Pokhran of India conducted what it termed a peaceful nuclear explosion in the Rajasthan desert in May 1974. India stated clearly that its test was for peaceful purposes, not aimed at manufacturing nuclear weapons.
How did China react?
Highly critically, it viewed India's test as a form of nuclear blackmail intended to intimidate its smaller neighbors. The source notes the irony, as similar charges were leveled against China when it conducted its first nuclear test, though China's was undeniably aimed at weapons.
Did China reassure Pakistan?
Yes, China responded by reassuring Pakistan against this perceived nuclear blackmail by India and reiterated its support for Pakistan on the Kashmir issue.
And the issue of Sikkim also became a major flashpoint around this time.
Yes, emerged forcefully. China reacted very strongly when the people of Sikkim revolted against their ruler, the Chogyal, in 1974-75, and especially when Sikkim's subsequent request for merger with India was accepted by the Indian parliament, leading to Sikkim becoming an Indian state in 1975.
What was Beijing's reaction?
Vehement criticism. They blamed India for the problems in Sikkim, accused India of expansionism, bullying neighbors, gobbling up Sikkim, dividing Pakistan, encouraging anti-Nepal elements, protecting Tibetan rebels. A whole list of accusations.
And they refused to recognize Sikkim as Indian.
Declared that it absolutely does not recognize Sikkim's status as an Indian state and absurdly accused India of trying to create a great Indian empire with the backing of Moscow. Our source correctly describes these allegations as baseless.
How did India counter?
India rejected these accusations outright. Mrs. Gandhi argued that China had no right to comment on Sikkim given its own record in Tibet and its silence when Pakistan had absorbed the territory of Hunza. It's important to remember this Sikkim issue remained a significant irritant for decades.
Until 2006, as we'll discuss later.
Exactly. Amidst this backdrop of tension, there were small, tentative diplomatic gestures hinting at a thaw.
Like the table tennis team visit.
Yes, in 1975, a Chinese vice minister for sports led a table tennis team to India. Minor, perhaps, but the minister met senior MEA officials and reportedly spoke of traditional friendship. Ping-pong diplomacy, India-China style.
Perhaps this modest step helped pave the way for a more significant development, the restoration of ambassadorial relations in 1976.
After a long 15-year break since the 1962 war, Mr. K.R. Narayanan was appointed as India's ambassador to China.
Was there opposition in India?
Not significant opposition, according to the source, indicating a readiness on both sides to at least engage at a formal diplomatic level again. Scholar Jagat S. Mehta suggests China perceived India as more self-confident after the Bangladesh crisis, and also pointed to political changes in China after the fall of the Gang of Four in 1976, suggesting a more constructive mood in Beijing.
But relations remained strained even after 76.
Largely, yes. Throughout the latter half of the 1970s. The border dispute was still the major problem, and the situation on the ground in Aksai Chin was particularly contentious. The source notes the line of control there had effectively changed, with China extending its physical control.
Other issues remained too.
Yes. The problem of the Karakoram Highway, built by China and Pakistan through territory India claims. And China hadn't forgotten the asylum granted to the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan presence in India. Peking frequently accused India of stirring up trouble in Tibet.
Against this backdrop, China started suggesting putting the border dispute on ice.
Yes, in the 1970s and early 80s, the Chinese leadership indicated a willingness to do this, suggesting they focus on resolving other issues and developing functional cooperation first.
What was India's initial response?
Under Prime Minister Morarji Desai in 1978, the stance was that no substantial progress could truly be made in other areas unless the fundamental border dispute was resolved. However, despite this official stance, the source notes that in practice, both countries didn't let the border problem completely freeze normalization in other areas.
A significant diplomatic step was Vajpayee's visit in 1979.
Yes, External Affairs Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee visited China in February 1979, the first high-level ministerial visit from India since before the 1962 war.
But it was cut short.
Unfortunately, yes. Vajpayee's visit had to be cut short abruptly when China chose to launch a military attack on Vietnam while Vajpayee was visiting a provincial Chinese city.
Despite that, were the discussions fruitful?
Generally seen as fruitful on bilateral issues, except on the core border issue where no significant progress was made. Notably, during these talks, China didn't unilaterally raise Kashmir or object to Sikkim's integration.
Did Vajpayee raise India's concerns?
He did, specifically about China's historical support for insurgency groups in India's northeast. The Chinese reportedly responded that this support was a thing of the past. And indeed, after the visit, arms supply to Naga and Mizo insurgents appeared to have stopped. Hostile propaganda also reportedly muted.
So an understanding emerged.
An important understanding that the unresolved boundary question, while important, wouldn't completely stand in the way of improving functional cooperation. Jagat Mehta felt the results were positive and downplayed the significance of the Vietnam interruption.
So Vajpayee's visit, despite the drama, was a step towards normalization.
A tangible step. The post-1980 scenario saw slow but steady improvements continue. Goodwill missions were exchanged during 1981-83. Trade, though modest initially, 12 MIs in 1978, was initiated. India's Vice President Jati visited in 1978.
And when Indira Gandhi returned to power in 1980.
She utilized this normalization initiative. Notably, she met the then Chinese Premier Hua Guofeng in May 1980 in Belgrade.
First PM-level meeting since '61.
Exactly. Since Nehru Cho, they reportedly agreed on the need to pursue improving relations.
By 1981, China's policy approach became clearer.
Yes. They aimed to upgrade relations without conceding too much, particularly wishing to avoid steps that might injure ties with India's neighbors like Pakistan, Nepal, and Bangladesh.
So the policy was, Leave the border problem alone for now.
Essentially, yes. China officially adopted the stance that the complicated border problem should ideally be left alone for the time being, allowing the two countries to proceed with building economic, trade, cultural, social, and political relationships.
How did India view this?
India generally agreed to a temporary freezing of the border issue to facilitate progress elsewhere, but our source notes that an indefinite status quo on the border was certainly not seen as being in India's long-term interests.
This idea of putting the border issue on ice was famously articulated by Deng Xiaoping.
Yes, China's paramount leader. In October 1982, Deng reportedly told an Indian delegation led by G. Parthasarathi that it was best to put the border issue on ice and concentrate on improvement of relations.
But he left the door open for talks.
He added that Indians could continue negotiations and perhaps one day a solution would be found. He even offered a blunt suggestion for a potential solution: effectively legalize the present line of actual control as the international border.
Basically, keep what you have, we keep what we have.
Exactly. A direct proposal to accept the status quo on the ground as the final boundary.
Did negotiations continue despite this?
They did, but without any significant breakthrough. Several rounds of talks were held at various levels, including 7 rounds at the official level specifically focused on the border by July 1986.
And during these talks, China's swap proposal emerged more clearly.
Yes. China began to suggest more explicitly that it might be willing to recognize India's claim in the eastern sector, McMahon Line, only if India was prepared to concede and allow China to retain the large areas it occupied in Ladakh, Aksai Chin,
The package deal.
which became central to China's negotiating stance, but remained and continues to be totally unacceptable to India.
The first visit by an Indian PM since Nehru finally happened in 1988.
Rajiv Gandhi visited Beijing in December 1988, a landmark visit. He met with Deng Xiaoping, the source notes. Deng reportedly shook Gandhi's hand for 3 full minutes, a symbolic gesture.
What was the assessment of the visit?
Jagat Mehta observed that Rajiv Gandhi succeeded in creating a striking improvement in the climate for better functional relations. However, Gandhi was heading towards elections in 1989 and, despite having a large majority, was reportedly unable or unwilling to take bold decisions on the border during this visit.
What about the Narasimha Rao government that followed?
Lacking a clear majority, it was often focused on survival, but it did continue exploring further normalization.
Chinese Premier Li Peng visited India in 1991.
December 1991. PM Rao and Premier Li Peng agreed on increasing cooperation. A joint communique included an interesting point expressing concern over an international oligarchy, seen as a veiled reference to the U.S. and allies posing as human rights protectors.
The source questions the parallel there, given Tiananmen's is square.
Yes, suggesting it was more about balancing against perceived Western hegemony than shared values on human rights.
But despite these high-level visits, the basic obstacles remained.
Absolutely. The unresolved border dispute and the problem of Tibet and China's actions related to it remained fundamental blocks. Numerous high-level meetings continued, but bore no concrete fruit on these core issues. Similarity of views was sometimes noted on international issues, parallelism, but didn't translate.
What about Tibet during this time? The Dalai Lama offered negotiations.
Yes, he offered to negotiate with the Chinese, suggesting talks in Geneva, proposing genuine autonomy if China allowed it. India's position remained consistent. No interference in China's internal affairs, recognizing Tibet as a region of China, but wanting a mutually acceptable border solution.
So a period of continued difficulty on the core issues, even with some engagement.
Exactly, demonstrating how hard it was to move beyond those legacies.
As the world order shifted post-Cold War, how did analysts suggest India approach China?
J.N. Dixit, a former Indian foreign secretary, suggested India needed to structure a realistic and practical relationship.
Meaning what?
Meaning addressing the boundary issue devoid of emotionalism, focusing on pragmatic solutions. He also stressed candidly articulating concerns about Tibet and Sino-Pak defense cooperation and actively seeking ways to overcome these frictions.
Jagadas Mehta had a broader view on the diplomacy needed.
Yes, he felt both India and China needed to adapt to the post-Cold War disorder. This demanded mature diplomacy free from euphoria or pessimism, guilt or paranoia. He saw both as necessary pillars for a stable international system.
The underlying reality was China's rise.
Clearly, China was well on its way to becoming a major global power. Managing the relationship with such a powerful neighbor was, and remains, a fundamental concern for India. G.P. Deshpande viewed China not necessarily as an adversary anymore, but certainly as a competitor in trade, world politics.
A powerful nuclear neighbor.
Exactly. So India's policy needed to encourage cooperation, perhaps in the punch-deal spirit, while being realistic about competition and security challenges.
China signaled its desire for friendly relations with President Jiang Zemin's visit in 1996.
A very significant visit, November 1996. Jiang Zemin held all three top posts: president, party head, military commission chairman, the first ever visit by a Chinese head of state to India.
What came out of it?
Wide-ranging talks aimed at furthering normalization. He met the president, PM, opposition leaders. The source suggests China was also actively seeking alternate markets for its goods from economic liberalization and seemed keen to revive the Panchil spirit, celebrating its 40th anniversary in 1994.
Narasimha Rao had emphasized Panchil's relevance.
Yes, calling it the only relevant answer in a conflict-driven world during his 1993 visit to China, which initiated a renewed push.
But China's motivations were rooted in national interests.
Always. The source points to instances like the Vietnam attack during Vajpayee's visit or a nuclear test during President Venkatraman's visit as reminders that China pursued its goals independently. India, while wanting normalization, was conscious of not being relegated to a second-rate role.
China was consolidating its power.
Yes, nuclear status, territorial claims elsewhere like the Spratlys, superpower ambitions all pose potential challenges to India's role, especially in South Asia.
And the China-Pakistan alliance continued post-Cold War.
Yes, China maintained very close military and political relations with Pakistan. While initially maybe enemy's enemy, its continuation even as Sino-Indian relations improved elsewhere was perplexing. Continued association with Pakistan's nuclear program, but also, strangely, supplied fuel to India's Tirupur plant.
A complex picture. This led to critiques of India's approach.
Yes, the source notes a disturbing trend where India sometimes appeared to be primarily reacting to China, positioning itself as an object of Chinese policies, overly focused on how India figures in China's scheme of things.
What did J.N. Dixit argue instead?
He strongly argued it was time for Indians to shift focus and examine how China should figure in India's scheme based on objective facts. Largest nation, economic power, vast military, strong self-perception, great power ambitions, central role in Asia.
And the China-Pak link made China
A potential adversary, despite improvements elsewhere. This nuanced view, balancing cooperation with realism, became crucial.
Moving into the late 1990s, this brings us to the period after India's second nuclear tests in May 1998, Pokhran II. This initially caused a setback.
A significant setback. China was a bitter critic, stood by UN Security Council Resolution 1172 denouncing the tests, called for de-weaponization, and imposed some bilateral sanctions.
But things changed relatively quickly by mid-1999.
Remarkably quickly, yes. A clear improvement started to become visible. A crucial factor, highlighted by our source, was China's role during the Kargil conflict between India and Pakistan in the summer of 1999.
What did China do during Kargil?
China put pressure on its close ally, Pakistan, in June-July 1999 to pull back its forces and the intruders from the line of control in Kashmir.
That was a major shift, wasn't it?
Hugely significant. For perhaps the first time in a major India-Pakistan conflict since 1965, China publicly sided with the international community's call for Pakistan to respect the line of control. This was seen as serving the cause of a more multidimensional relationship, moving beyond automatic alignment with Pakistan.
Diplomatic visits underlined this shift.
Yes. India's External Affairs Minister, Jaswant Singh, visited China during the Kargil crisis. His visit was on formal invitation, contrasted with Pakistan's FM Aziz's visit, which was reportedly self-initiated to seek help.
What was agreed during Singh's visit?
They agreed to strengthen confidence-building measures and initiate broader dialogue. And critically, China assured India of its support for India's position. Intruders must vacate Kargil, LOC must be respected, a clear vindication for India coming from China.
But China's stance on the nuclear issue didn't change.
No, even with warming ties, China's stance remained consistent. On the eve of the 50th anniversary of the PRC in October 1999, China reiterated its support for UNSC Res. 1172, calling on India-Pakistan to destroy nuclear weapons and prepare for CTBT signing.
What about India-Pakistan relations generally?
China's assistant, FM Wang Yi, stated India-Pakistan were important neighbors. China hoped for improvement via direct talks, a more neutral public stance.
By fall 1999, the rhetoric from China warmed up.
Perceptibly, Chinese officials started speaking again of warm ties, tradition, friendly relations. even Panchsheel as a model of international dealings.
Acknowledging India's security concerns.
Yes, publicly acknowledged India had legitimate security concerns, stating all questions could be discussed. A Chinese foreign ministry spokesperson noted that while there had been some twists and turns, the general trend has been very good and friendly. A clear shift in language.
This paved the way for high-level exchanges.
Yes. Indian President K.R. Narayanan, considered an expert on China, paid a highly successful visit in May 2000, described as a watershed moment, building trust.
Followed by Jiang Zemin's return visit.
Later in 2000, strengthening trust. He invited PM Vajpayee to visit China.
Vajpayee's visit eventually took place in June 2003. It was delayed.
Yes, due to engagements and the volatile international environment, particularly the Iraq War, which began earlier that year without explicit UN authorization.
India and China found common ground on Iraq.
Interestingly, yes. Both strongly opposed the UK-US action without UN authorization. This highlighted some convergence on advocating for a more multipolar world, even while both were simultaneously developing closer ties with the US.
A paradox noted in the source.
Exactly. Other visits also occurred during this flux. Vajpayee visited Russia in May 2003, had a brief interaction with the new Chinese president Hu Jintao.
Vajpayee had a vision for an Asian century.
Yes, suggesting India-China working together could make it one of peace and progress. Later, Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao underscored the need for more democracy globally. These visits happened amid unprecedented global uncertainty.
Alongside these geopolitical discussions, progress was attempted on the border.
Slow progress. The Joint Working Group, JWG, met 14 times by 2002 without major breakthrough. The 14th meeting saw an exchange of maps for the western sector, following an earlier exchange for the central sector, a move towards clarifying the LAC perception.
Officials expressed cautious optimism.
India's FM Yashwant Sinha felt progress was moving right. Chinese Premier Zhu Rongji in Jan 2003 hoped for a new constructive partnership.
It was during this period that the Sikkim breakthrough occurred.
Yes, a significant breakthrough on that long-standing vexed irritant.
Remind us, China had refused to accept Sikkim as part of India since 1975.
Vehemently opposed it then, but subtle signals of change began mid-90s. China played down the issue, sent tantalizing signals of preparedness to recognize it. By the early 2000s, Sikkim had been an Indian state for nearly 3 decades.
Was there linkage expected? China wanted India to declare on Taiwan-Tibet first?
Reportedly, yes. China expected India to categorically declare Taiwan-Tibet as integral parts of China. India, of course, never questioned Taiwan and recognized Tibet as an autonomous region of China since 1954.
How did Vajpayee handle Tibet during the 2003 visit?
He put a new spin, stressing Tibet autonomy within China, reaffirming India's consistent position, but maybe signaling continued interest in autonomy.
The key development for Sikkim was the trade road agreement.
Yes, through Natu La Pass, connecting Sikkim and Tibet. This agreement, by implicitly recognizing Sikkim as the Indian point of connection, effectively implied China was accepting Sikkim's status, even without a clear statement at that moment.
A face-saving mechanism.
Seemed like it. India consistently accepted Tibet as Chinese territory while emphasizing autonomy.
Vajpayee felt they were moving in the right direction.
Yes, on both border and Sikkim. Acknowledged the road ahead is a long one, but a good beginning has been made. C.R. Rajamahan had predicted Sikkim would be the easiest place to start normalization.
This allowed reopening border trade.
Exactly. Reopening the trade link revived a historic silk route, aimed to boost local economies, and crucially, removed a significant irritant.
De facto recognition became clearer later.
Yes, October 2003, Bali ASEAN Summit. Vajpayee and Wen Jiabao met. China reportedly removed Sikkim from its website list of independent Asian countries. One apparently told Vajpayee about this.
Interpreted as clear de facto recognition.
Widely interpreted that way, solidifying the shift implied by the trade route agreement.
And formal recognition followed.
Yes, in 2004, China ceased treating Sikkim as an independent nation annexed by India. Then, April 2005, during Premier Wen Jiabao's visit to India, he categorically told PM Manmohan Singh Sikkim was an inalienable part of India, no longer an issue.
Explicitly stated in the joint statement.
Yes, referred to Sikkim as a state of the Republic of India. Chinese side handed over official maps showing Sikkim as Indian.
So, a final resolution after 30 years.
A significant breakthrough showing even sensitive territorial issues could be resolved.
Alongside Sikkim's resolution, economic ties were booming.
phenomenally. One of the most dynamic and encouraging developments. Consistent double-digit growth for several years, from almost nothing to $5 billion by 2002.
Targets kept increasing.
Rapidly. Zhu Rongji initially set $10 by 2005. Vajpayee win in 2003 doubled that, aiming for $10 by 2004. Seemed ambitious, but Indian exports were growing over 100% in 2003.
Did they meet it?
They exceeded it. By 2004, trade crossed $13 billion. Then Manmohan Singh later hoped for $20 by 2008. Projections suggested 40 BAS by 2010. Growth was astounding 56.8% in the first 4 months of 2007 alone. The economic relationship became central.
Nathu La Pass reopening was a symbol of this.
A tangible symbol, yes. July 6, 2006, Dalai Lama's birthday, coincidentally, reopened after 44 years, revitalized that historic silk trade route via Tibet and Sikkim.
Initially limited.
Yes, limited items and days, but expectations were high for increased scope and volume, boosting local economies.
A joint study group on economic cooperation was agreed in 2003.
Yes, during Vajpayee's visit, tasked with exploring FTA lines, identifying areas for trade enhancement, investment, joint ventures, hopes also to address unauthorized dumping of Chinese goods in India.
But despite economic growth and Sikkim's resolution, the border dispute lingered.
Stubbornly, proving much harder to resolve. Discussions continued via the JWG 14 times till 2002, and the special representatives appointed in 2003.
Any agreement on the LAC?
No agreement reached even on the precise alignment of the line of actual control or its verification, let alone a final settlement.
The main stumbling block remained China's swap idea.
Yes, reiterating the proposal, give Aksai Chin for recognizing McMahon Line. Totally unacceptable to India. Talks held in secrecy, little detail, lack of visible progress indicated deep differences.
An agreement in 2005 reiterated peace on the LAC.
Yes, to strictly respect and observe the LAC, maintain peace and tranquility, underlined the need to manage the border even while the dispute remained unresolved.
However, China continued to claim Arunachal Pradesh.
Yes, formally claimed the entire Indian state as Chinese territory, refused to accept it as Indian even into the first decade of the 21st C. The source gives the example of denying a visa to an IAS officer from AP in 2007, canceling a group visit.
Highlighting the claim remained active.
Despite progress elsewhere, yes.
Were there areas of limited strategic convergence?
Yes, both articulated a desire for a multipolar world order. Both officially committed to global nuclear disarmament.
High-level interactions continued.
Leaders kept in touch. Hu Jintao and Manmohan Singh meetings in 2006-07 helped understanding and managing complexities. Trade continued its rapid growth.
Manmohan Singh's assessment in 2005 was positive.
He felt relations entered a new phase of comprehensive development. They agreed to establish a strategic and cooperative partnership for peace and prosperity, a significant upgrade in description. He felt special rep talks were moving right, appreciated Sikkim recognition.
So, pulling back, the journey through this source material shows a relationship of dramatic swings.
Absolutely. Ancient friendship, post-independence hope, Panchil, Hindi-Chini Bai-Pai.
Then the abrupt turn. Border dispute, 1962 war, decades of hostility, the China Pac axis, Tibet, Sikkim.
Followed by the slow, complex, often tentative path back. Diplomatic ties restored, confidence-building measures, huge economic growth, Sikkim resolved.
Yet always with those core border challenges remaining, defining the limits of trust and full normalization. It's a relationship living in that tension.
Cooperation, conflict, competition between two massive rising powers.
Absolutely. And understanding this history isn't just academic, is it? It's crucial because it lays bare the core issues. The unresolved border, Tibet's shadow, the geopolitical landscape, including the China-Pakistan factor.
It really underscores the complexity, not straightforward friendship or rivalry. It's dynamic, multifaceted, between giants with deep memories, competing interests, and that inescapable shared, disputed border.
The analysis reflects this. India balancing principles and pragmatism. China asserting national interest, different views on how India should navigate realism, candidness, mature diplomacy, recognizing China as a powerful competitor.
So ultimately, why does this deep dive matter to you, the listener? Because how these two giants interact has profound implications far beyond their borders. It's crucial for regional stability in Asia, global power shifts, and managing relations between major nations with complex pasts.
It leaves us with a really thought-provoking question, echoed in the source itself. The text notes accurately that a border settlement cannot be a sufficient condition for normal Sino-Indian relations, but it is a necessary condition. Still true today. So consider this. Given the state of the border talks slow, opaque, even in the early 2000s, and contrast that with the explosive growth in trade and economic ties, how might that fundamental push and pull between huge economic opportunity and persistent unresolved territorial claims continue to define the future of India-China relations?
That delicate ongoing dance.
And what does that dance mean for the wider world watching these two increasingly powerful giants navigate their deeply complex relationship? Something to think about.